We're live. Hello, Eternal Life fans. I have some awesome, amazing transhumanists here. We're thinking about just talking about the future of privacy and some other cool topics, political. All right, let's do it.
Yes, thank you, Rowan, and welcome to everybody watching this. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II. I'm the chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party, and I will begin this discussion by reading section 1 of the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform. So this was the first section of our platform that our members ever adopted. The subject of privacy was so important to us that we believed it crucial early on during my tenure as chairman to take a stand on this set of issues. And this section 1 reads as follows. The United States Transhumanist Party strongly supports individual privacy and liberty over how to apply technology to one's personal life. The United States Transhumanist Party holds that each individual should remain completely sovereign in the choice to disclose or not to disclose personal activities, preferences, and beliefs within the public sphere. As such, the United States Transhumanist Party opposes all forms of mass surveillance and any intrusion by governmental or private institutions upon non-coercive activities that an individual has chosen to retain within his, her, or its private sphere. However, the United States Transhumanist Party also recognizes that no individuals should be protected from peaceful criticism of any matters that those individuals have chosen to disclose within the sphere of public knowledge and discourse. So this is very much a vision of individual sovereignty with regard to privacy. The idea is each of us owns the information about our own lives and the prerogative to choose to share or not to share that information with other people. And if we choose to share it, we have to accept the consequences of doing so. So if we say something about ourselves and another person dislikes it or criticizes it, we run that risk, and we have to accept that we are going to run that risk. But if we choose to withhold that information and keep it private, keep it within our own realm, then nobody else has the right to insist on that information unless we're harming somebody else, unless that information might be used in the commission of a crime, for instance, or evidence in a criminal proceeding. So there are situations where preventing harm to others might override somebody's privacy, but those are extreme situations. We shouldn't acquiesce to routine violations of our privacy for the sake of some perceived larger goal. And hence the mass surveillance systems, for instance, the systems used by the National Security Agency in the United States that Edward Snowden disclosed, rightly so in my view, in 2013, should be seen as particularly appalling and an abuse of technology. That's not to say there's no room for technology that harvests data on a broader level, but there should be consent with the use of that technology. And that consent should be genuine, not just clicking through some screens where there's a user agreement that nobody reads, but an actual understanding by each person of what they're giving away when they're agreeing to use that service. And I would say this is an important subject to discuss because technologies for monitoring and tracking individual activity have certainly been developing. We are well into the so-called age of big data, where not just governments, but a lot of private companies try to make a living off of harvesting individuals' personal information and monetizing it. I would say a fairly benign form of monetization is the kind that essentially uses personal information to feed you advertisements, but you are free to choose to purchase the product or click on the ad or not. But you're still a free agent within the market economy when you do that. And it could be a little bit annoying, but most people accept that because they get some free service like YouTube or Facebook. So I'm actually not so concerned about that. I am concerned about essentially these data brokers collecting personal information and then third parties using that information to make major business decisions or decisions with social implications toward an individual. For instance, let's say you're a health enthusiast and you post a lot of comments on Facebook about how you want to cure cancer or you want to cure diabetes, and you're posting about healthy lifestyles, and you think you're also performing a public service because you're informing other people of the value of healthy lifestyles. But a lot of these algorithms that mine your personal information are not particularly intelligent, at least not yet, and they're devoid of context. So what they'll be seeing is a lot of reference to cancer, to diabetes, and they'll flag you as a person who's associated with these terms. And perhaps a third party, maybe a health insurer, is going to purchase that information. And unless somebody is there to protect you from the misuse of that information, that third party might decide, you're at a high risk for cancer or diabetes, even though you've posted nothing of the sort. It's just the stupid text mining software that made that inference. And so they might decide to raise your premiums or not issue you health insurance. And there are actually regulatory protections today, by the way, that would prevent that particular situation from happening. But the reason why I bring this up is if there are no protections for privacy, if there's no attempt to restrict somebody from doing that, then anything goes, essentially, in that kind of field. And we need to be very deliberate about policies that ensure that your data is your property, just like your physical belongings are your property. And then with your physical belongings, you can choose to keep them or you can choose to sell them. And if you sell them, then you don't have control over what happens to them afterward. Or you could choose to rent them. So you have a house, for instance, or you have some furniture. You can choose to rent it to somebody else under certain conditions. And you could say, okay, you may take possession of this, use it in certain ways, but not in certain other ways. And there could be limited prerogatives that you could give to your data. So for instance, with Facebook, you can tell Facebook, I agree to have my data used by these advertisers, but I don't agree to have my data given over to health insurers, government authorities, other types of entities that might use the information for purposes that I can't immediately foresee or wouldn't be comfortable with. So this is where policy is very important. And I will say one more thing that I think is informative regarding the context of this Section 1 of what is now Article 6 of the U.S. Transhumanist Party platform. It was adopted shortly after the Zoltan Istvan era. So Zoltan Istvan, when he was chairman of the Transhumanist Party, when he was campaigning for president, I think he was a bit careless with his language. So he was saying things like, oh, privacy is going to be obsolete and everyone is going to be surveilled, but it'll be for their own good. And I strongly disagreed with that. A lot of other people strongly disagreed with that, even though we recognize the great benefits that Zoltan brought to the transhumanist movement. We saw it as necessary to essentially check some of that kind of rhetoric, which we don't believe to be helpful. So we adopted a conscientiously pro-privacy stance in order to make sure that transhumanism isn't seen as this malignant force that might subvert people's autonomy over their own lives. Quite the contrary, we want to enhance individual autonomy, and I think privacy is an important part of that, at the very least.
Yeah, it's a really touchy subject. So yeah, we definitely want to be articulating ourselves. Alex, you're muted.
Now, what you've said about leading with this idea of privacy protection in the writing of the charter documents of the United States.
Can we say that Alex is muted?
There we hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I think that was an interesting argument made from Chairman Stolyarov about the civic argument for privacy. I believe there's also a cultural argument to be made. So the philosopher Michel Foucault, his famous text *Discipline and Punish*, was made this famous analysis of Jeremy Bentham's concept of the panopticon. Essentially, the panopticon is where you have a prison from shaped like a stadium with a tower in the center, such that the prisoners feel they are being watched at all times. And even if there is no one in that guard tower, they cannot tell that they are being watched, so they behave. It's a psychological trick. And I believe the cultural argument for surveillance could be made to suggest that this, even the sense of being surveilled, even the sense that the NSA and these Silicon Valley companies are monitoring our data, could shift our cultural health in ways that could become extremely toxic. It could sort of stratify us socially, suppress our creativity. It could create a stalemate and preservation of the status quo if we are not encouraged to voice our authenticity. So I think that is another interesting argument that could be made before we move on to candidate Ben Zion on for his opinion on privacy. I would say that is the very embodiment of the panopticon concept in action.
Yeah, it's pretty scary.
Yes. So Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think between all of us, we know a few techno-futurists, and I was thinking about this a moment ago, a sort of ranking of the most defining features of a techno-futurist, because none of those folks have exactly the same worldview. And I think that the thing that most defines the people on this call is probably the number one of those, an interest in a longer lifespan. A second would be an openness to some sort of techno progress, a sort of techno singularitarian view. And I think that those things are relatively uncontroversial compared to some of these lower things on the list. Maybe third might be some interest in some post-nationalist kind of identity. And fourth might be an interest in some kind of collectivism that tends to fly in the face of these privacy protections in the longer term that are described in these charter documents. And we have to think, as Zoltan did in those early stages of the United States Transhumanist Party, I think, of the implications of that, the optics of it. But we also have to find ways to strategize. A lot of these things, I'm interested in them, but I think I'm not the only one on this call who would say that the thing that I really want is a universal super longevity. And I think that the universal is not just it's not just a bleeding heart notion. It's the most important thing there is that there is a network effect, that the more users there are making use of this service of longer lifespans, the more likely that any of us, no matter what means, even if we have all the money in the world to spend, we might not be able to achieve such a thing. But a large number of people participating really does change that equation. And other things of this kind, in parallel, can change that equation quite significantly. So in the pre-interview, Rowan and I pointed out that we both enjoyed the book The Circle, the Dave Eggers book. And effects of that kind that have very little to do with life extension could nevertheless accelerate the timeline of that outcome. As far as the state of the research, we have, I think, the technology in the course of these 2020s to go from 110,000 people dying a day of old age to a much smaller number. But people, of course, we need to invest. Policymakers need to invest, and our civil society needs to invest in more of that research. But what we really need to invest in is things of this kind, things that change the way our civil society and we interact with one another, these kinds of force multipliers.
Yeah, man. And, life extension and aging research will, there's so much money being wasted, right, on specific diseases. And when we could be tackling this at a systemic level. And so, there needs to be massive change. And that's why we really need these transhumanist politicians and these political platforms to be way more involved. Because look, like, it's not that we're going to be transforming it. Like, yes, we will be involved with transforming things, but this transformation is coming, and we need to be, manning the ship. And so, we're the men for the job, and we know other men for the job also. And this is the most important conversation that exists right now.
Yes, indeed. So I would suggest that with a lot of these medical advances, the question of privacy will also become more salient because of personalized medicine and the vast amount of data that people will need to have gathered about themselves in order to monitor vital statistics and keep the body healthy. For instance, instead of getting blood tests at most every few months, but for many people it's once a year to measure your blood glucose level, you might have a device that measures it continuously. And you would be able to track, for instance, what leads to the greatest spikes in your blood glucose level, or if it's on an uptrend, you would be able to notice that sooner and take corrective measures. So with that kind of technology, of course, in your hands, it would be amazing. It would be great to have this information and use it to guide your health decisions. But you wouldn't want just anyone to have that information about you. You wouldn't want your employer necessarily to have that information about you. You wouldn't want any decision maker with power to control the costs of your health care to have that information about you. So this is where it's important to develop a robust technical architecture of data privacy so that the people who need this information and who would benefit from it would have full access to it, but the people who would use it for ulterior ends would have no access to it without permission. And you could give permission to others to use that information as well, for instance, to your doctors or your caretakers or your family if you need your family to know. But you wouldn't give it to just a random person on the street or someone with the power of the purse over you.
Well, Dr. George,
Again, I would.
But better for whom and for what purposes? My purpose, for instance, is to maximize my own health, my longevity, my well-being, my prerogatives as an individual. So I would want the information that helps me do that. I wouldn't want other people to have information that would stop me from achieving those goals. And I think that's the case with everyone who has this kind of individualist view. But with this individualist view, you need to recognize the kinds of inviolable boundaries around each individual's personal sphere that enable individuals to act to the furtherance of these ends. So if I have that prerogative over my own information, then to have it be logically consistent, it needs to be universalizable. So it needs to be applicable to every other individual as well.
Yeah.
It's
Dr.
very
George
interesting, depending on the kind of governments that come to capitalize on this technology.
Exactly.
I trust many of you might be familiar with the film known as Gattaca, which portrays a scenario in which
It's my favorite film.
a eugenically motivated authoritarian government could get a hold of the data and intensify the classification of people into different genetic tribes, such that class differences right now, which are relatively tame in terms of quality of life, could dramatically spin out of control, such that we are again organized into a genetic underclass and a genetic upper class, this time irreversible by societal standards. And the danger of this is that what some might consider to be racism would be, in some sense, justified by the fact that the genetic changes have been made such that we regress to a point where these classes of human beings are no longer the same species. And I think that could be very, very dangerous if the if such structures ever manifested in our society.
Yes, I think there's always a danger when information is used to classify rather than to improve, because that assumes a kind of fixed, stagnant hierarchy that the information would somehow capture and clarify in a more refined manner. But in reality, much of the world is in flux, and so are people. So people are continually changing in terms of their biological potential and their intellectual potential. And this is the primary reason why it's dangerous to stratify individuals, because it assumes that whatever relative hierarchy of ability or health or what have you might exist by happenstance today is going to remain the same through time immemorial, even though empirically that's not the case. And people rise and fall all the time in accordance with whatever metrics one could think of. So imposing a rigid stratification attempts to kind of freeze the present distribution, whereas what we should be trying to do is to uplift everyone in terms of every metric that could be improved. So I'm in support of genetic modifications for both physical and mental capabilities. But those genetic modifications should be gateways to liberation for individuals. They shouldn't be used to enhance some people while other people are prevented somehow through some coercive apparatus from acquiring them.
I would also add
to say
that an individual
about,
is allowed to choose their own method of liberation. I find many of these, the practice of eugenics in the past, the conditions for what may have been a useful gene or unuseful gene were defined sort of a priori without any academic rigor behind it. And I think before we make such strides in allowing certain companies like 23andMe to be able to share our medical data with the government, we should put in place preventative measures that would prevent this kind of a priori categorization of the superior genes from the inferior genes. And I would second your take on that.
Right.
I would say of the 23andMe concern, there's oblong power dynamics in play that have little to do with the state there already. The owner of that entity, GlaxoSmithKline, has been accumulating a lot of data, and that this is how these things have been sold a decade and a half ago in the context of what first brought us to this conversation, state surveillance. This is just metadata. It's not being used against you. It's just being collected for a larger and more important grand design. And this is something this is exactly what's said in this context with medical data as well. But there's an awful lot of situations today wherein if you've participated in something but you no longer own that information yourself and are not able to benefit from it for life extension or more mundane health purposes. And we ought to have freedom of information in this context to a far higher degree. This is a very much a side effect of a country that is very much controlled by certain kinds of special interests.
Yeah, there's a lot of data out there on
in terms of your candidacy. I would like to ask if I would like to infer on what could be done about these this data collection, in the sense that how would we solve this problem without government interference, given that you are from a libertarian persuasion.
Can I say something first before we get into that?
Please.
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of problems with privacy right now in medical data, and it's a great point what Johnny brought up about personalized medicine, because that's about to become huge, I mean, a revolution. And our data, our medical data on the black market goes for like 3 times more than even our social security information and even our banking information. So people really want our medical information, and it's almost like 90% certain that your information is actually already on the black market.
Wow.
I don't really know too much about that, but Dr. George Church said that. But I actually think that I agree with Zoltan that there's gonna be no privacy in the future, and
a lot of people think there's no privacy right now. Do you know who those people would be?
So we have privacy right now.
Do you guys know who
it's hard-
those people would be that I'm talking about?
The NSA?
Well, that's probably one group. Well, even the NSA probably wouldn't think everything is being monitored. I'm talking about people who literally think everything by every human being would be monitored right now.
Is it Alex Jones?
No, it's anyone. What I'm getting at is anyone who believes in the simulation theory essentially believes we're all in a matrix. Which, if that's the case, there is already no privacy.
Yes. So this idea of the simulation theory takes us back to this less wrong-esque thought experiment of Rocco's basilisk, in which we construct a hypothetical superintelligence in the future that would be able to scour our metadata for clues as to who might have been a supporter of it in the past, and then perhaps torture these beings in simulation hells and sort of retroactively incentivize its own existence. I think that's
I don't think
a far-out idea, but I don't think we should take it too seriously.
That's why we
I
need
think
to
we should take it
fear
fairly
the
seriously.
hypothetical simulation.
Not the punitive side of it. Not the punitive side of it.
So you guys want to fight? You guys want to fight for privacy? That's what all you guys want is for privacy.
Yes.
No, privacy is privacy is a kind of a legal fiction, and it's relatively low on the list of on the to-do list, in my view, and I think for the Transhumanist Project. I would so to answer Alex's question before. In a roundabout way, the things that I think the Transhumanist Party and myself should be advocating for are things that achieve that universal super longevity and human development goals commensurate with something like these singularitarian effects. I think that focusing on legal abstractions and legal fictions to too high of a degree it definitely interferes with that. And if you think of yourself as a servant of some future superintelligence like Rocco's basilisk, maybe not a mean guy though. I think that you would make better use of your time to support things like human well-being and longevity.
Well, I would say that privacy is a key constituent component of human well-being, because really each of us has, and historically has had, two spheres to our lives, the private sphere and the public sphere. And the private sphere is what allows us to be more effective in the public sphere. Just like I think it's a good fact of existence that other people can't look inside your mind, at least not without your permission. There is some limited telepathic communication that has been demonstrated via cutting-edge experiments a few years ago, but it's more like somebody presses a button in one country and another person can essentially feel that experience in another country. But
are you saying you would actually express some concern about hooking yourself up to the cloud and putting the neural lace in your brain and putting chips in your brain? Are you actually saying you're a little skeptical of that?
Well, I would insist on some pretty stringent controls. The prerogative of each individual mind to serve as its own absolute gatekeeper. So if somebody wants a direct line of telepathic communication with me, I will want to define the parameters of that communication and say, okay, you can transmit certain information to me directly, but within certain boundaries. Like you can transmit into my mind a picture of this meadow. I'd like to be able to envision what that meadow looks like, but nothing else. And that's all I'm giving you permission for. It's like with file uploads to computers. It's a bit of a crude analogy because the mind doesn't exactly work the way that a digital computer
does. You're saying you actually have a problem with giving over all your mind and memories and thoughts over to, like, say, a corporation like Facebook. You have actually, you take issue with that? Like, really? Really?
If I might concern, the idea of the system of neoliberal capital in which we all participate. An individual might actually be incentivized in order to afford this technology to perhaps trade their data in exchange for the technology. So, for instance, if Rowan would like a Neuralink and could not afford it, perhaps the company might offer his data as leverage. Perhaps Rowan could allow them to have a 1-year free trial period of his brain and the collection of his metadata in exchange for being able to use the product. And I think that is one way in which people could be coerced into the panopticon to have their thoughts privatized by corporations. I don't think Elon Musk would be has voiced any intent to do so, but I do believe it could become a concern.
Something like that is already going on. Have you guys heard this? Aging app that like makes your face age, and a lot of people were using it, and then as a result of doing that, it basically signed away the rights to your face to this app company, and they own the rights to your face forever. They can use your likeness.
So since Ben is running for the presidency, I would really like to and he's really interested in or you said you're for privacy, right, Ben?
Well, sure. Everybody has that privacy.
I personally, so far from my research, it seems like it would be better to fight for no privacy for anyone.
It's an interesting.
Well, I wanted to call back the Dave Eggers circle discussion, and maybe I think I know Chairman Stolyarov's thoughts on this to some degree. But one of the subplots of that book and the central theme of that book is this idea that. Public figures have a different sort of modified social contract relative to ordinary folks in present day, wherein they give up some of these liberties that other folks still are able to cling to. And this was something that occurred in this story to a very high degree. It was a thing that was a catalyst sort of event for this happening across the society. Is, in a word, a YouTube statesman emerging. A person who is streaming their entire life as a political figure. And I wonder, Chairman Stolyarov, if you think this would be a net positive for society at this time, if you have feelings where any possible drawbacks of a thing like this.
I think to a point, it might be positive. So I would say, to the point that this person live streams official functions of government, like attendance at meetings or deliberative processes over policy, or even, say, trips to meet constituents for his campaign, or because he's their representative and he wants to connect with them, that would be a positive. People can tune in and see what this official is up to. But there are personal aspects to everyone's life that shouldn't be broadcast to the public, particularly because they create situations of personal vulnerability. A very simple and fairly tame example is I wouldn't want to be live streamed while I'm asleep, because you could even think back to a very primal motivation for that. If you're asleep and you're a primitive Paleolithic human, you're probably in a cave or by a campfire somewhere, and you want to make sure that you're protected. If somebody is watching you while you're asleep, you don't know what they're going to do to you. They might stab you with a sharp object while you're asleep. They might hit you over the head and take your stuff. In any event, you want to be sure that when you're asleep, everything is completely secure and protected, and you're not subject to that kind of danger. And besides, what use would it be to the public? What benefits?
They loved it in the movie Truman Show. They loved watching Harry Truman sleep. It was like their entertainment. They would tune in and watch him sleep, and
So yeah.
Hey, but how are we gonna wait? Before I go on, I gotta ask you guys: how are we gonna institute a system of perfect justice without, totally monitoring everyone's thoughts? How are we gonna have a system of pre-crime, like a Minority Report, so where we monitor what they're gonna do before they even do it, and then put them in jail before they even do it, right?
Yes.
I'm just joking, of course. I'm not in favor of that. I'm just being ironic.
Things of this kind in the near term are far more likely to derive from predictive algorithms than from some strange collectivist sort of thing. the state of predictive algorithms is getting to be quite good, such that we might be able to never concern ourselves in just a few short years with an unexpected earthquake or hurricane again. Human affairs are a little more capricious, but the same principle seems to be something that we could begin to count on. That in a few years we'll be able to have a list of bad scenarios in the course of human events that could occur and plan accordingly or try to prevent them. I think that's the thing that distinguishes you or I from people of the futures. No matter how much money you have or how smart you are, you don't see anything coming. Nothing, and that's possibly about to change. And I think that is something that we have to find ways to use and inform the public about. Ray Kurzweil spoke more or less on this subject at RadFest a few months ago. Gennady and I listened to him. But ordinary people they have a mental block on subjects of this kind. They prefer to. They really don't like thinking about it. They're willfully blind to it.
Hey guys, what do you think? I want to know all your guys' opinion. What's your guys'
at all?
What chances do you think? What chances do you think that we already have a social credit system like China? And ours is not public. Like, we don't know, but just like China's being monitored all the time, what if we already have one like that? What do you guys think of the chances?
That, right?
What?
Snowden. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
It's
okay.
Bobby, go ahead.
So yeah, I was gonna jump in. So yeah, I mean Snowden, right? And what's it called? WikiLeaks, right? Didn't they provide a lot of evidence for that?
Yes. WikiLeaks.
So I wanted to express to you guys that we likely have to fight for no privacy. Because I agree with Gennady that Zoltan doesn't really articulate this very well, and this is a super touchy subject, and if you're running for presidency, it's like you're gonna want to be able to explain this really well, and so there's reasons why we should have no privacy, right? Well, first off, reducing privacy is going to reduce a lot of crime. How are you going to abduct somebody when you only have self-driving cars on the road, right? That are analyzing everything. You have humanoid robots walking everywhere, recording everything constantly. We already have Alexas that are in over 70 million Americans' houses, and there's some cases of them calling cops. And so privacy is going to go away quite a bit, and so we're only going to be stuck with our thoughts now. Well, that's going to go away, I think, because so once we develop long-distance brain-computer interfaces, which I've actually heard some people in the government say it's already been developed, but once you have something advanced enough that's long distance, maybe from a satellite or something, imagine hacking into someone's brain and you control their motor functions, their sensory functions, right? Those two gyruses right here. And so you could hack them and you can make them seem like they're doing, they're normal on the outside, but on the inside they're in living hell, which would be the most evil thing that is going to occur in the next 15, 20 years. Maybe even 10 years, within governments. And so we're going to need, how are we going to prevent from being hacked? Well, we might need to actively survey constantly.
So, you know who you sound like right now? The main guy from The Circle, who says knowing is good, but knowing everything is better. Like you're that guy right now. You're making that argument that I just predicted someone would make.
I would want to answer your question, Rowan. I think I wouldn't speak specifically to the social credit system, but there have been these Snowden-esque revelations of different kinds. Finding out that the FBI has the power to hack, have its backdoors to everyone's iPhones, a dozen things of this kind besides. So I would say it's a fair assumption to say that there's a few more backdoors of one kind or another that we're not wholly aware of. I would also want to say of a social credit system that the Chinese social credit system is not really that great. But the other side of a social credit system that people don't talk about, an awful lot of society's scarce resources are put towards provincial cultural institutions or non-productive enterprises. And social credit system, even one that is not impressive in any way, could do a lot to reorient people toward in the direction of techno progress.
Have you guys ever have you guys ever compared or have found parallels between social credit system, like something in China, and basically what every religious person believes, which is like basically God monitoring everyone? It's like the eye in the sky. It is basically
the omniscient God.
It's the divine social credit system. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. So
which is why I promote we should fear.
But those people don't really believe
we should fear the hypothetical God that we could be already trapped in the Matrix. There could be the AI God monitoring everything, judging us, determining which of us gets to live forever. It's like part of my eternal life strategy is to be considerate of that possibility, at least.
So Rowan, are you familiar with the work of Dr. Yuval Noah Harari? He actually espouses your position here, the idea that this new God will emerge. He in his work Homo Deus, he talks of this new religion called Dataism, and it's essentially Christianity for the information age. What he's saying is that these algorithms we're creating, eventually they'll come to govern us better than human beings can. So the AI, which is distributed across all our search engines, our smartphones, our self-driving cars, will all start sharing data and become this global consciousness, this digital God, which will be directing our movements. So Harari, interestingly enough, he agrees with you, and he argues for this sort of neo-reactionary techno-monarchist kind of position, whereby this artificial superintelligence would then be able to understand you better than you understand yourself. And Harari believes we should sort of relinquish government control to this digital monarch, to this AI God.
Ooh.
And this AI God would be like Santa Claus. He would know who's sleeping, who's awake. He'd know how to deal with them. He'd know how to reward them. Speaking of which, your idea of love, he would know this God, this
he'd
digital
be the
God.
ultimate matchmaker. He'd be able to set you up with the perfect eternal love for your,
Yeah, you'd be able to set you up with an ideal mate, so to speak. And I believe this system of government is called algocracy, and it's a very authoritarian system that I'd like to hear Gennady and Zion comment on to see how this would perhaps contrast with their libertarian leanings.
So as an atheist and neo-enlightenment thinker, I reject all gods, including future AI gods. I believe in human free will. I believe that we as individuals have the power of choice, and to be able to decide to defy any proclivities or predictions. This is why I think the concept of pre-crime is antithetical to genuine justice, to get back to an earlier point that was raised, because at every moment we have the ability to decide to do something or to decide not to do it, no matter what background we have, no matter what genetics we have, no matter what ostensible predispositions we have. So even if a predictive algorithm says you're 99.9% likely to commit a crime, at any moment you can choose not to. You can choose to take the courses of action that would essentially lead you in the correct direction. Mm-hmm. This is why the principle of being innocent until proven guilty, the principle of having individual rights, having the benefit of the doubt, is so important, and privacy allows that. Now, Rowan asked, well, how do we prevent injustice in such a situation? I think the answer is very simple. Most people actually have no intention to commit crime most of the time. If you think about society today and how easy it would actually be for somebody to steal something if they wanted to and get away with it, the fact that this doesn't happen left and right would suggest to you that the vast majority of people actually don't want to steal most of the time. There are a few who do, and they cause trouble, and they cause enough trouble to keep law enforcement busy. They cause enough trouble for everyone else to take rudimentary precautions against their belongings being stolen. But the fact is, most people are decent enough that they don't want to commit crime, and so they don't need to be surveilled. It's the same argument that I and many other libertarians have been making for years against TSA surveillance. The fact is, most people aren't terrorists or even close. So subjecting them to these surveillance procedures only creates lag,
how about this?
Unnecessary violations of privacy.
Do you think it's strategically wise to, if not surveil people, at least promote the idea that they might be being surveyed, like without them knowing, like that we could promote promote the idea that everything they do might be watched, everything they do might be recorded. So based upon the idea of being better safe than sorry, people might be afraid. People might be more afraid to do immoral things. They might be more afraid to commit crimes, and therefore you'd see a promotion of morality in society. It's the same. It's the same concept that like religion and the idea of a god, right? Wouldn't that promote morality in a population if they think everything they're doing is being watched and monitored? That could make people behave more morally. Do you think that could be?
That creates a chilling effect, though, and Alex alluded to this earlier on. The idea that you're being monitored could also stifle your creativity, your harmless experimentation, because you always have this inkling that the monitoring may be subject to different standards from your own standards. So your own standards might be don't kill, don't steal, don't abuse people, and that's fine. But the standards of those doing the monitoring could be you need to wear gray shirts all the time, or you need to conform in other respects to cultural or societal expectations. And this is the kind of chilling effect that happens when people think that they're being watched. The simple answer is we can trust most people most of the time not to commit malfeasance. The key is, how do you detect the very few who are actually going to be a problem? And I would say the answer to that isn't continuous monitoring of everyone's activity. It's enough engagement with those people to be able to spot warning signs. So one of the reasons why a lot of the school shooters or other lone wolf type criminals were able to get away with mass atrocities that have taken a few tens of lives each time was because they largely did not communicate their situation or their thoughts to other people, and other people largely didn't care enough about them to actually check in periodically. In prior eras, when communities tended to be smaller and more geographically localized, it would have been very hard for someone to get away with such a scheme, because people would come by their houses every so often and say hello and drop by for tea, and people in agricultural societies, for instance, would spend a lot of their time outside. So if you were in a particular community, chances are you were seen many times per day. And I'm not suggesting that we go back to that era. There's obviously a lot of benefit to living in. There's a lot of benefit to living in these larger decentralized communities with more anonymity. But we should get back into a situation where everyone has some kind of supportive social network that would be able
so
to.
I'm just going to take over
problems.
I'm just going to take over for Rowan here. I don't understand. I think he might have had something urgent he needed to do with his roommates. We could segue on to a different topic. So we've got this sort of I can see sort of two worldviews forming here. We got on one side you have Bobby and Rowan with this idea that yes, we should surrender ourselves to the algorithms, to the algocracy, to the rule by algorithms, such that they can perform utilitarian.
I'd be in that camp too.
Such as the reduction of crime, the reduction of poverty. And on the other side, I see we have Ben and Gennady, who are claiming, no, we have this idea of Kantian libertarianism, free will, rather than your determinism, your techno-determinism, and we would prefer that we make the decisions and not the algorithms. What my question to you guys is could you possibly foresee another a civil war between this determinist view and this Kantian view, whereby the people who believe in free will stand their ground, and those who don't will submit to this algocracy? Do you think these worldviews could clash, perhaps create violence, and do you know which would prevail over the long run?
Well, Hugo de Garis certainly does think that that's
the Ardalect War. I read it.
I think that we in concerning ourselves too much with this, we might sometimes overlook what advanced algorithms actually look like, and there's some movie logic that can come into play with something concerns of this kind to some degree. There is not going to be an artificial singleton, and we already have a lot of the things that we're talking about in hushed terms in the course of this conversation to a high degree. People all across the UK have agreed to CCTV with the understanding that this is metadata that isn't going to be used to impact them in any real way. In the United States, we've had entire systems of government and corporate surveillance that we have more or less happily accepted with the same understanding. And I would say that there's a lot of downsides to accepting that from more or less the rights of citizens and consumers, but there's a lot of upsides conceivably to things of this kind as well. And so I would put myself a little bit in Rowan and Bobby's camp, as long as there's not these kinds of developments aren't creating a staunch Luddite resistance.
So you think there could be a synthesis between this sort of neoliberalism and neo-reaction
it's more of a steering,
techno-monarchism,
right?
I think there could ever be
the
harmony with the algorithms.
So it might be inevitable that we have no privacy. So, but it's certainly inevitable that we're going to decrease in privacy by a lot over the next 10, 20 years. So it's really about steering that, right? Because no one's going to be able to stop this progress. An asteroid's not going to hit us, okay? An asteroid hasn't came for a while. It's not going to come in 20 years, okay? Very statistically unlikely. And
hey, Bobby, what do you think the chances are that maybe we already don't have any privacy? That we're in a simulation? I don't know if I've ever asked you that before. Do you think we could be potentially in a simulation and everything we're doing is being monitored and used against you in the court of eternal life?
I would say that's a thought experiment that should inform our thinking to some degree on this, because it will tend to give people some kind of assurance that too much fear about this is not terribly material, and I don't think that it's terribly material. The main thing that derives from an incredible breakthrough in advanced algorithms is the solving of grand human challenges. These that are not presently solved. The existential risks, in my view, or concerns for civil liberties, those are very, very low on the list of effects in the aggregate compared to the good things that come from this.
You know, Gennady, you were saying something really interesting. You were saying that it maybe not be good that people think they're being monitored, because then they would kind of be afraid to experiment. They'd be afraid to do all these things that maybe are innocent, but they would be worried, oh, maybe they're going to get in trouble for it. It's
the worry of cancel culture and such.
It's kind of a very similar situation to what we already have with religion, right? People thinking, well, I can't do this and that because God might be watching me, right? But think about this. If you replace God with the hypothetical God, and then say, well, we can't really know what the rules of this hypothetical God are. They could be anything, right? We kind of have to fill in. It's like becomes a big question mark. What would this God be what would this hypothetical God be monitoring us for? What would be the criteria of judgment? And if instead of giving like a defined set of rules, like all these religions give us, they give us the holy books or whatever. If we just said, it could be anything, like have your best guess, then they would be kind of filling in that question mark with whatever they think it would be if there was a hypothetical God. This is what I try to do with the hypothetical God. I try to make people consider that, okay, maybe their actions might be watched and might be judged, but we wouldn't know how they would be judged. We wouldn't really know what the rules are. We kind of have to guess what the rules are. You think that doing this is, at least thinking in this way and considering that possibility could be strategic personally, but then also might benefit society if they were to kind of have the idea that what they're doing might be judged in some sense, that there be a system of judgment or some kind of karmic system that we can't define clearly, but that the idea that there could be some kind of system like that where every action they're doing could have consequences, eternal consequences in this thing. It could make society, I think that could make society better. What do you think?
Well, I have two thoughts on that. First of all, historically, humans have been very adept at interpreting and reinterpreting theological doctrines to kind of fit what they were intending to do anyway. People have a knack for inventing elaborate justifications for their actions and then persuading themselves that, oh, this is what a hypothetical God would have wanted to do. But second, we don't need a hypothetical God for that tendency anyway, because we could think from the standpoint of eventual consequences of one's actions, however those consequences arise, just through the workings of the laws of nature. If you do X, then Y might eventually happen, or it might not. The world is complex, but you think there's a higher probability of Y eventually happening, and you would configure your actions. But the difference between that kind of thinking, the hypothetical God thinking, or the thinking of causation through the laws of nature, some obscure chain of causation, and predictive algorithms that actually try to surveil people or try to classify them, is that the latter would be very much real and very definite in their operations. So people might be guessing at what they're doing, just like right now a lot of people are guessing at what financial behaviors will affect their credit scores, as an example. But the fact is, those algorithms would be programmed in very definite ways, and those ways may or may not be conducive to optimal human well-being. My view is algorithms of this sort would need to be transparent. They would need to be available to the public, and the public should have input over how they're designed and how they're deployed, especially if there's a broader societal purpose. Now, not every predictive algorithm necessarily affects individual privacy. For instance, if it's a road maintenance algorithm and its goal is to set up an optimal schedule for repairing the roads or sweeping the roads or deciding which roads to prioritize after a snowstorm, that's a fine algorithm to deploy. Everyone would benefit from it. There's no loss of privacy from that. But people should still know how it works. People should be able to audit the code, and they should be able to point out vulnerabilities, just like with open source software today. The best software is one that actually has the code fully available, and then various so-called white hat hackers are able to look at the code and see, well, how is this vulnerable to bugs? How can we improve this code so as to patch those vulnerabilities? Whereas closed source systems often have exploits that were actually there from the beginning, the zero-day exploits, but people don't figure out the existence of those exploits for many years, and then after millions of people already have this operating system or this program installed, some black hat hacker figures out how to compromise that system. So I think we need transparency of the AIs, of the algorithms, of the monitoring systems, but at the same time, we need to preserve the individual sphere of experimentation. I like to think of one's thoughts as a kind of testing ground. They're preliminary. You don't necessarily want everything that is ruminating in your mind to be instantly made available. You want to work on it. You want to correct any mistakes with it or any preconceptions. Just like if you're working on a piece of writing, you don't necessarily want people to see the first letter you typed or the first version of a sentence that you typed. You want to present your product when it's ready, when you think you've done enough work on it that it's prepared for other people to provide their feedback and their reactions.
I think that's an interesting segue that I'd like to take to Ben for a second, since he's running for the candidate for the Transhumanist Party. So I'm interested in how he'd deal with what Gennady described, this scenario in which we must change the way in which we develop these super intelligent, not necessarily super intelligences, but algorithms in general. We need to make them more decentralized and open source, such that the people, the regular person, could have input into how these algorithms are programmed, such that the AIs we're creating are built to do more than just sell us advertisements. And I believe Elon Musk has this project called OpenAI, and he's sort of doing some pioneering work there, whereby he's trying to create a decentralized AI with a transparent source code. But I think we need to do a little more. I think we perhaps need to bring blockchain into the picture, like create sort of an AI based on blockchain, whereby the editing of this algorithm could be sort of like Wikipedia, whereby the people, us, could have input into how these algorithms are created, and then we only choose to use the social networks which adopt this decentralized method of AI, and sort of I hope to one day delete my Twitter. I hope to delete my Facebook. I hope to delete my YouTube in favor of these more decentralized artificial intelligences that will be that will be the sort of social networks of the future, the artificial intelligence social networks. And I wonder if you would have any policies that could sort of be conducive to breaking up these big companies and their control on our government, sort of sharing data with the NSA and sort of collaborating to bring the boot down on us, the people, and what you could possibly do about this in your candidacy.
Mm. Well, one thing I would say is I would recommend that you watch the Singularity weblog episode featuring Tristan Harris of the Stanford Media Lab, where he talks at some length about decentralized options and protocols that could allow for the creation of decentralized Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and a lot of times many of these things are questions of what of how the marketplace adopts these things, right? Those protocols and prototypes for companies of that kind already exist, but they don't have very many users, and that is unfortunate. I wanted to, before I speak to that a little bit more, I wanted to answer Roan's question a little bit more length about the benefits of this panopticon and this advanced algorithm type scenario, and say that we might, in some cases, and not I think it's good to focus on this, but we might in some cases be focusing too much on the effects on individuals, and not enough on the effects on institutions. Just about 4 months ago, a film came out called Dark Waters, which described it was a very good movie. You should watch it. Just with Mark Ruffalo, it described how the DuPont company foisted on the unwitting public a whole host of very, very dangerous chemicals, and also defrayed costs by dumping those chemicals into ground. Into the water table in very disturbing ways. And this kind of thing, the solving of grand human challenges and the preventing of future existential risks because of institutional problems, not because of necessarily any one individual we could point to at DuPont who's responsible for this, or any one individual in the United States government who's responsible for this sort of move over the last 4 decades to the United States becoming sort of something more of a corporatocracy. But we can use things, this organizational strength and this overall power in advanced algorithms to prevent these things from happening in the future. That should be, those concerns should be the top dozen concerns of this kind. And then I think concerns about the impact on an individual, because we don't want somebody to be victimized by a black box, and that will happen. But the job of a politician is also to think about a big picture and the interworkings of many institutions and cultural properties, and not just a worst case scenario, sort of a movie plot line affecting one person. Yes, I do apologize. I'm realizing that my phone is at 4%, so I would like to speak more to this, but I'm going to remain on the call, but I'm going to turn off my video for a moment and address this.
Absolutely. I could, if while we're waiting, I could sort of pose another question for candidate Ben Zion about religion. So this is a topic I assume a lot of us are looking to get into. I assume everyone on this call is atheist, with the exception of me and Rowan. Rowan being a classical theist, me being more of a Spinozian pantheist. But the idea of religion is very concerning to people in the discourse of transhumanism. And I believe some religious ideologies may be forcing their way back into transhumanism themselves. I don't know if Chairman Stolyarov or candidate Zion, you've heard of Anthony Lewandowski. So Anthony Lewandowski is a Silicon Valley billionaire who has recently started his own church. So I've been calling him Alatoya Lewandowski, or the Pope Lewandowski. He sort of started this robot cult by which they worship not necessarily Rocco's basilisk, but they sort of pledge their loyalty to this future artificial superintelligence, which will collect their metadata and find who's loyal. So in some sense, he's organizing kind of a hierarchy, a clerical hierarchy, with him at the top and sort of priests at the bottom. But there's a problem here. This could lead to. I take this very seriously, what Rowan said about Nick Bostrom's simulation argument, because this idea of simulationism, as some have called to call it, futuristic religions predicated on Bostrom's hypothesis, could manifest as actual world religions that would sort of take over the power vacuum left behind by Islam and Christianity, should they fade away completely. These new religions would take up this power vacuum, and I assume that perhaps we anarchists and the libertarians could form sort of a coalition to sort of address how we would fight against these new monarchies and theocracies that could the techno-theocracies that could emerge in the future and lead to the same sort of suppression of human rights and human suffering as has occurred in the past from these sort of cult-like organizations. In general, do you think that we have a sort of a plan for how we would address the return of fundamentalist religions?
Do you guys have my video and audio?
Yes, it sounds much better. It's not static anymore, Bobby. You're good.
Cool. Good question to John and audio.
Yes. So my thought is, to counter any kind of fundamentalist religion, one needs to have an environment of broad tolerance and cosmopolitanism. So I'm an atheist, but I'm not a militant atheist. And certainly the USTP has been welcoming to various strains of religions as long as the individuals espousing them have themselves been tolerant. Now, I'll make a generalization. It doesn't always apply, but newer and recently established religions tend to be more fanatical and more exclusivist than older religions. And the reason why is older religions simply have had more time to kind of integrate themselves into the broader world and the broader society. And when Judaism was in its early stages, read the Old Testament.
Yes.
The Jews were some of the most aggressive genocidal people out there. Early Christianity was filled with fanatics and political persecution.
Yes, history may not repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Right. And of course, during the early days of Islamic expansionism, there was a lot of bloodshed as well. And out of the three Abrahamic religions today, Islam is the youngest and the religion that has the greatest problems with fanaticism.
So age plays a role.
Yes. The age
it's tough to know if Christianity is worse or not than Islam, because Christians are, for a number of different reasons, but I think Noam Chomsky would make a really good argument for that. Christians are the most fanatical and the biggest terrorists of the world.
Well,
would you like to elaborate on that, perhaps?
Certainly on this continent, there's a kernel of truth to that.
There were eras in human history, like during the time of the Crusades, when the Muslims, by and large, tended to be more cultured and more humane than the Christians. But I would say someone like Noam Chomsky also has an axe to grind, in the sense that his enemies, strictly speaking, are very close to him. They're the Christian right in the United States. So sometimes he inveighs against the Christian right, but he forgets that the worst of the Christian right aren't going to cut off people's heads for apostasy. And that's important to keep in mind as well. There's
the only thing that differentiates.
So I'd like to agree with a second here.
There's
I'd like to take a moment with Rowan's idea and Chairman Stolyarov's idea and sort of expand them a little bit. So Bobby said, I agree with Stolyarov's assertion that the newer the religion, the more fanatical, because it has had less discourse, less time for the dialectic to sort of develop in that religion. And we do see that the Jewish religion is the most liberal, followed by Christianity, a little less liberal, and lastly, sort of Islam, the newest religion, being the least liberal of all. And I do believe there's a necessity for time for religions to become de-radicalized, and that certainly does pose a danger. If these new techno-theocracies come about, they would be new religions, perhaps even more fanatical than Islam, and perhaps Islam would be the least of our problems. But to also agree with Rowan, I believe, and sort of contrast with Bobby here, I don't think the Crusades are a very good example of sort of religious fundamentalism. I believe the Crusades had a geopolitical motivation initially. The Seljuk Turks sort of aggressed upon the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire enlisted the help of the Western powers to sort of create a holy cause to come geopolitically assist the Byzantine people and the people who were conquered by the Seljuk Turks. And I do believe there was some justification in this, not necessarily the holy war, but the geopolitical war, that these people were now subject to the brutal, violent rule of the Seljuk Turks. But it depends on which of the Crusades we're talking about. I'm of course talking about the first,
Right.
but it's a whole can of worms we don't want to open. But I would agree with Chairman Stolyarov's sort of insight as to how we could possibly sort of categorize religions in terms of their radicalization. But how do you think we could de-radicalize these techno-theocracies that could come about?
Yes, we need.
Of resurrection.
That's a really good question. Anyone else? I think whichever society
I'd like to say something.
is the
go on,
most.
Bob.
Go on,
Say, Ben?
go on, Ben.
Oh no. I've said this a few times before. There have been ancestral DNA analysis that demonstrate that you and I, the Queen of England, the Pope in Rome, everyone on Earth is 6 or 7 generations removed from incestuous cannibals. People who are doing all sorts of awful things of the kind that we would describe in these earlier empires. That's not the world we live in today anymore. A world with universal literacy and, most importantly, providence. Develop more or less a high degree of development the world around. I watched a television spy show some time back called The Honorable Woman. And it's about a British-Israeli industrialist woman in question who becomes actively involved in a plot to more or less surreptitiously enact a 2-state solution between Israel and Palestine. And even though she's an Israeli and a Jew, she's very interested in doing this because the main idea being establishing some kind of providence everywhere you go, and these other things become far lesser considerations in that event. If you have a developed country, if you have political and economic stability, these things don't matter anymore. We started off this conversation talking mostly about the news sphere, about the networked world. And now we're talking about things that were hardly relevant even 4 decades ago, before we lived in the networked world, and certainly not terribly relevant to the outcomes of the 21st century relative to concerns like political and economic stability.
Well, I think the question that Thomas is posing is whether some of these newer religions could potentially become more fanatical and more illiberal than some of the more traditionalist religions in their resistance to a more open techno-futurist vision.
It's not necessarily the ethnic origins of these founders of these religions, because the cult structure exists across all racial boundaries. For example, the Mormon Church also used to have a very cult-like structure, but they too have liberalized. So we do see this sort of decline of the cult structure as there are critiques of the religion. But it's interesting how candidate Zion, you segued into this sort of a contrast between Israel and Palestine, and Rowan brought up what would the transhumanists party's opinion on Muslim and Islam would be. I assume there are people in the comments section right now. Rowan, you got the comments open? I assume there's probably the alt-right.
I know a few Muslim life extensionists. I don't think that there's any worldview that's wholly incompatible with techno-futurists.
I think we could, for Muslim America, how do you think we could integrate into the transhumanist worldview? Well, Sheol, we can't discount Sheol in the Old Testament, but that has more rigorous
That's only because they have
but this could segue into a foreign policy question. How would we sort of accomplish? Yes. So that's actually the topic. So Rowan has a foreign policy question here for candidate Zion regarding the sort of contrast between Israel and Palestine, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank wall, and the sort of settlement structures, the possession of the Golan Heights, and this sort of escalation of nuclear arms between Israel and other potential countries like Iran. And how we could sort of what his opinion on foreign policy would be, because I assume we got people in the comments, the alt-right people going open borders for Israel. We got the liberal people saying two-state solution. How do you think our America's foreign policy approach, should you be elected president? How do you think we should Israel-Palestine contrast?
Before Ben answers that, can I say I think it's really important that the next to have my input on the theism that you guys were discussing. I think the next step for atheists, for the atheist movement, right now it's kind of like atheists just kind of ridicule theists, right? It's really easy to make fun of a theist because they believe in ridiculous things and they don't know science very well often.
I don't think it's that ridiculous. Bostrom's simulation argument has been one of the most fascinating arguments for Christianity in the past 1,000 years. Not since Aquinas have we had such a sophisticated argument for God. But yeah,
but look at all the videos of all the theists like being made fun of, And so I think the next step for atheism is we instead of ridiculing theists, now we have to heal theists, right? Like I see so many people, in like comments and stuff making fun of deathists, for example. And we need to you're not supposed to make fun of these people, okay? They're going to commit suicide. That's not funny, okay? We need to heal them, okay? We need to convince them that life is more important than death. And it's extremely... He's all over. No, he
yeah. So Musk believes in.
He doesn't believe.
Yeah. So Rowan, I don't know if you know about Elon Musk and his belief in Rocco's basilisk, but that's actually how he got the date with Grimes. Is he sort of shared that thought experiment with her, and now they're both sort of these technical in a way. But yeah, just to return to the question on foreign policy, I don't want to put candidate Zion in the hot seat here, but I assume many of our audience is probably wondering how we would deal with our foreign policy in the Middle East. And do you think there could be what do you think transhumanists should pursue in our foreign policy?
Yes. Well, I think it was a little bit of an ugly thing that Sam Harris said when he described if he were able to wave a magic wand and remove one thing, either religious literalism or sexual violence, just in terms of the negative impact on society, he would go with the former. And that's a strange sort of framing of that concern. But it's also not wholly untrue. So I should say that I don't necessarily see that religious literalism has a great role to play in how I would imagine ultimately the 21st century shaping out. And also we should say that if you include these folks who are culturally connected to their faith and traditions, but not necessarily religious literalists, people who don't hold that a book has magical properties, peoples of the earth, we're neglecting in this conversation that peoples of the earth are overwhelmingly not religious literalists of this kind, even though there are many hundreds of millions of Muslims and on this continent a pretty large number of Christians. But in other parts of the world, Christians are largely post-religious, post-Christian. They don't hold those same kinds of ideas on other continents or on the European continent to very much of a degree. But I think in terms of, it's a big question, peace in the Middle East, and if a candidate had a good answer to that question, the real silver bullet to that question, they'd be getting a Nobel Prize already.
Yes.
But
should we just?
Do you think transhumanist ideas could expedite that process?
Should we ask Ben the question
Yes.
we're all wondering? Is Ben Zion a Zionist?
Oh, I dropped the bomb. Okay, yeah, the comment
the
section's
big
going nuts.
question.
yes. Well, I don't. No, the short answer to that would be no. Not in any sense that you're imagining.
Darn it.
I want to say something also before Ben talks about that.
I will take a moment to.
Make sure we should cover the debate that we're setting up in a little bit. Let's make sure
We'll get to it. We'll get to it. Go on.
I will take a moment to speak to a kind of slightly more the common thread between all of the people on this call, to a high degree, an interest in this universal super longevity, which I do regard as a sort of a metaphorical Zion, that particular outcome. And so, in that sense, I am absolutely a Zionist. As to this realization of some ethno-state or things of this kind, that doesn't hold a terrible amount of interest to me.
So you think this is interesting? This question of ethno-states and ethnicity. Do you think what should be the sort of policy on globalization? I believe globalization has stirred up quite a bit of controversy between the various right-wing nationalist movements in Europe right now, all over the Western sphere. Do you think there's possibly a transhumanist solution to all this racial tension? Perhaps maybe gene hacking clinics that could give you certain racial features, or perhaps this withdrawal into the virtual world whereby our avatars gradually erode racial boundaries. Do you think there could be kind of what we call the culture war? Do you think there could ever be a solution to the culture war?
I think that techno-singularitarian outcomes already in process are those very solutions, and I think that those there's uptick in far right sentiments in some in particular areas. They almost always they correlate overwhelmingly with income instability and economic instability and concerns of that kind. This is a deflection strategy shared by all of us, wherein we want to find a scapegoat because we are unable to address the more relevant institutional concerns. And this is so I would say that but I also, a part of this conversation throughout has been the role that an interest in super longevity would play in this stabilization as well. And I like what Rowan said about Israel being a place like that. Our friend Ilya Stambler, as both a policy man and a research man, has done an awful lot of good work there. The people there are very, very open to life extension, even relative to other places in the developed world. And I would say that that particularly is something that we can hold up as a model, whatever criticisms we may have of other Middle Eastern affairs.
That's an interesting an interesting point you made there about the economy. The sense that if the economy is bad, we tend to look for someone to blame for the bad harvest. And I would say your argument is very well presented by the fact that East Germany and West Germany, if you look at an election map of Germany, the poor area, East Germany, is overwhelmingly either National Bolshevist like Nazbol or AfD voting. So I do understand that this idea of economic insecurity perhaps has us fighting over the table scraps and perhaps trying to keep ration out amongst the in-group as much as possible. So what do you think our solution could be to overcoming this economic hardship? Do you think perhaps automation, universal basic income, or some sort of economic strategy, perhaps a ledger-based blockchain system for ownership of property? Do you think any of these ideas could perhaps blunt this economic hardship and get us reorganized as a species?
Well, yes, I would say, and if you're not looking for an instantaneous solution, then direct digital democracy and blockchain governance are very, very good in creating a trajectory towards that level of stabilization. I think if you are looking for a silver bullet, it actually would tend to one thing that might have this effect to a fairly high degree would actually be a market solution, which is so in recent days I've done some podcasts and interviews with someone from the Nigerian State Department, some futurists on the subject of a crypto city in Senegal, Akon City, which would be run by a cryptocurrency, Acoin. There's a lot of interest in the futurist community about this, so I've been doing some interviews on this subject. And if we were looking at the developing world, and one thing that could catapult these folks in the direction of greater stability, it would be something like Elon Musk's Starlink, I believe, and also the similar projects from Google and Amazon organizations. I think that data should be regarded as a human right, and that is a part of my futurist New Deal. And I think that focusing on its role in development in contexts of this kind could have a dramatically bracing effect on the kind of instability that we've described.
So, candidate Zion, one last question about the culture. I've been reading this book called Polystate, a thought experiment for a distributed government. And the author, Zach Weinersmith, I believe, he speculates on this idea that perhaps a futuristic form of government could allow, let's say, I know you're familiar with the division between red states and blue states, the two Americas. There are two Americas right now, and the sort of center is disappearing. And a lot of the street violence we see is an inability of these people to get along. So Zach Weinersmith, his book, The Polystate, has a sort of solution for this, whereby which this sort of digital governance could create two states within one state. Sort of the polystate is a geopolitical entity in which overlapping states exist side by side, but you are subject only to the laws of one state. Whereby which, for example, California, you could change your statesmanship. You could get a new citizenship and not be part of the blue state government of California, and you could have an overlapping red state government. So this is the idea of the polystate, whereby which two governments can exist in the same country. Do you think this is a solution we could be looking towards if the division continues to persist?
Yes, I don't see this deriving directly, it's possible, from a sort of a Civil War 2.0 scenario, but this idea of two parallel minarchist entities that serve different functions, more or less, one in the bricks and mortar world and one in the virtual world. This is a very exciting prospect. And there's a fair number of people, Facebook users or people who work for Facebook, who regard Facebook as an incipient entity of this kind. Yes, my feeling is that we should pursue any areas of this kind that might most reasonably and quickly be pursued with great fervor. And so, if that proves to be something that is a radical departure, if that proves to be something that's a radical departure from present theories of governance, then so be it.
What I was wondering was, I probably wasn't specific enough. I was wondering, because you are of the libertarian persuasion that one's income should go to should go to policies in which they actually support. For example, I think it's horrible that we force Democrats to pay for the wall using their tax money, or that we force Republicans to pay for whatever welfare programs they hate, or that we force everybody to pay for these horrible wars in the Middle East. And what I think the poly state could do is it could sort of direct your tax revenue to policies which you actually support. So by state within a state, I don't mean two separate countries in one state. I mean two different revenue collection systems by which all the Republican taxpayers would pay to the Republican government, and their money would be spent on Republican policies. Whereas with Democrats, all their tax money would be spent on Democrat policies, and this could sort of erode the culture war because you would no longer have that stress that you're paying for your own persecution. I should have phrased it that way. I'm sorry, bad phrasing on my part.
No, there is a very real case to be made here in this new sphere world that these empire-style entities might not be viable in the coming years, and that is a serious consideration and a conversation that we must all have. I'll bring it back to what Bobby brought up a moment ago by mentioning Adam Kokesh on March 4th in Chicago at the Chicago Hilton. If you're in Chicago, please get a ticket. It's $10 to get these tickets, and please check it out at freeatequal.org. We're going to have the largest multi-party presidential debate in history, the first of its kind of this sort of event occurring in a primary, and I will be there. Another life extensionist and friend of all of ours, Zoltan Istvin, will be there, and another gentleman, Adam Kokesh, who's made some similar arguments along these lines. That is, in fact, the thrust of his presidential campaign. In a word, if elected, he promises to disband the federal government, and he's largely an anti-militarist, one-issue candidate. He dislikes the role of the military-industrial complex to such a degree that he would advocate for this. And I would say that. There are ways in which this kind of local rule could prove to be very beneficial to some kinds of outcomes, and maybe not quite so dangerous to people physically as they might suppose. But we have to, as accelerationists, as singularitarians, as techno-futurists, we have to adopt some kind of precautionary principle in things of this kind. We want to see certain kinds of outcomes. We don't want to be advocating for things that lead to a tremendous loss of life or damage to infrastructure or property.
So one last question in case Chairman Stolyarov or Rowan Horn object. I have one more question about the potential for governments, future forms of governments we can take. So I suppose that might be a no on polystatism, but there's this other idea. I don't know if you're familiar with the economist and physicist Robin Hanson. I do believe he is of the libertarian political persuasion, perhaps even anarcho-capitalist. He's written famous books like The Age of M, which is about this sort of...
Yeah, I know Robin.
You know Robin? Yeah, so he has this other idea called futarchy, I believe. He's a futarchism, whereby we don't vote on values, but we bet on beliefs. Sort of like we have elected representatives that would formally define and sort of like manage this numerical operating system of sort of national welfare, and market speculators would sort of price these beliefs, and they would sort of like estimate like national sort of adopting particular policies based on like the sort of based on like sort of the quantification of gambling on these systems. Do you think? Are you familiar with Hanson's concept of futarchy, and do you think it would ever be feasible, or even make a candidate unelectable in the transhumanist party?
Yes. As to your other question, I would say that this is also the short answer is yes. These are good things, but I will say that I met Robin at a couple of events in recent months, and I have tremendous respect for him as an economist and futurist and political philosopher. I think that, for example, the Age of M, it does rely on a number of rather somewhat overwrought plot conceits. That may not necessarily prove to be things that are going to how the future is going to unfold. And so I would again reiterate something that I said before, which is in these things, let's keep trying to do what works. And I think in whether we're talking about new theories of governance, or whether we're talking about something that's more or less publicity stunt. Transhumanist publicity stunt, we should be thinking in terms of how we can impact people's thinking to get them out of deathless trance and get them on the path to pushing for universal super longevity, and also these other concerns moving us toward universal providence, political stability, in whatever form that may take. And certainly these minarchist and heavily technologically mediated ones in the longer term are I think, they're eventualities, and we have to plan for those accordingly.
I have a question for you, Ben. Have you thought about any publicity stunts to promote your campaign and transhumanism along the lines of the immortality bus that Zoltan
We could do some for you.
Yeah, we could help you think. We could do a brainstorm think tank for you.
Yes. So one of those, I have given this a lot of thought and spoken to a lot of folks about this. And one of these things that is coming in Q2 is I will be setting a record, a Guinness World Record, for the longest period of continuous augmented reality usage. And I'd like to work with you guys to possibly make that into a relay event, wherein when I succumb to exhaustion, at the end of that, maybe hand the baton to someone else who will continue in that state of immersion, and maybe that could be something that goes on and on. That is also a standard sort of event in the Guinness record book as well. I've gone on record a number of times in various podcasts saying that I was interested in being normally abled patient zero for Elon Musk's Neuralink, and there's many kinds of things. So that's a pretty extreme sort of thing to do. But I think that the benefit of that increased ability to generate more work product and other kind of noosphere effects of the kinds that we've alluded to already in this discussion make such a gamble well worth it in my mind. So there's many things short of that I would happily do as well. So if you have suggestions for enterprises of that kind, I'd love to discuss.
Free government-issued sex bots for everyone.
So,
that should be your campaign policy.
So to comment on Rowan
Just kidding.
Here, I don't think we've touched on economics quite a bit. You said you were an accelerationist. So returning to sort of the founders of accelerationism at Warwick University, the Nick Land, City Plant, and Mark Fisher at the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. I understand they all had this idea of accelerationism, but they branched off into different kinds of accelerationism. So essentially, do you believe that eventually we'll be able to shed this system of neoliberal capital, globalism, or whatever you want to call it, and move on to a post-capitalist system? Do you think you're sort of a temporary libertarian, or do you think capital will persist long into the future, centuries, perhaps even centuries, or do you think it'll collapse due to the accelerationist idea of intensifying the contradictions between the the automation, the act of automation, and sort of the working class's ability to purchase the products produced. Do you think we could ever move to a UBI system, which would sort of create a new paradigm for capital, or even better, there's this other, I believe the economist, one of the a former economic advisor in the Greek government, Yanis Varoufakis, he doesn't like universal basic income. He wants universal basic dividends. So that's another idea we could look into. That's sort of like the citizens benefiting from the corporations themselves, sort of like universal stockholders, like universal stock shares rather than universal payouts. Do you think there's an alternative system that could be conceived outside of capital? Do you think we should be temporary libertarians, or do you think capital will come into the future?
Yes. Well, I would say that I feel fairly confident, and this is a speculative sort of statement, but I feel fairly confident in saying that we're at about 2 decades away from a time wherein the differences between a left libertarian and a right libertarian might be regarded as wholly academic. And that is very much owing to the acceleration of the kind that you described coming in the coming years. And I look forward to such a time. And I would also say, bringing this back to e-governance, that if you are a right libertarian or any kind of libertarian, but you haven't given serious thought to the ways in which decentralization and digitalization and direct digital democracy could hasten those effects, economic policy effects that you would tend to want to see. I think that maybe you haven't seriously considered this field that as much as you might suppose. So I would encourage people to embrace electronic voting, to embrace all of these other features of e-governance, like we see becoming very, very sophisticated in a country like Estonia. And you will quite quickly see that some of these other outcomes, in a word, of a very minarchist kind, coming in the coming years. But we have to advocate for those things as a society, and we have to take a stand for that.
Okay, Rachel Haywire, can I ask a question? Rachel Haywire, I have a picture of on the screen right now. She's one of your transhumanist competitors. She said that she wants to give us free $2,000 a month. So, have you ever thought about maybe giving $3,000 a month or $4,000 a month, like kind of outdoing her a little bit there?
Triple the yang.
Reddy stating as part of his proposal that he would give $1,000 a week. So he has definitely outdone.
Wait, who said that? Who said that?
Ben.
Oh,
yes, this is a feature of the Futurist New Deal.
Oh, wow.
Yes, a middle class freedom dividend.
Nice.
A middle class freedom dividend funded by this same mechanics as the originator of this idea, the federal land dividend, Zoltan Istvan. This is funded through the leasing of federal lands, in our case, to carbon neutral companies who maintain a very specific other set of guidelines. And there's many, many of those, not just in the United States, but the world around, people who would be in China who would be chomping at the bit to lease those kinds of lands. These lands are valued at above $180 trillion and could be leased in this fashion to generate monies that could provide every 18 to 63-year-old this $1,000 a week, this federal land dividend, this middle class freedom dividend. So this is something that flies in the face of many kind of austerity-based ideas in the United States, and also many others besides. Some people, for example, on the left, are resistant to this idea because they want to see some kind of other form of economic justice, and I would count myself as one of them. But we can't spend many, many decades fighting with Charles Koch to see some harm reduction here. We have to anticipate this jobless apocalypse and act accordingly in a big way. to see that people are able to live in the coming years.
Wow.
So
Vote
I
for Ben
think
Zion for a free $4,000 a month. That's pretty good.
Quadruple yang.
Secure the bag.
And
Secure the bag.
imagine it was Valentine's Day just a few days ago. Imagine the many millions of married couples who, if they had a middle class basic income for both of them, they would set aside their make work and maybe their jobs that they find less pleasing, and start businesses together. An act of love, and also an act very much in support of free market capitalism. The idea of a basic income is not an attack on the capitalist enterprise. It is the idea that imagining a monopoly board. Everyone has $1,000 a week. This is a better form of capitalism. It will promote many more sole proprietorships, partnerships, and cooperative forms. This only flies in the face of capitalism if your definition of capitalism is corporatist in nature.
Yes. Yes. So actually, I wanted to bring up the sort of the leftist critique of UBI. In a sense, many leftist thinkers are saying that UBI is actually a reactionary movement disguised as a progressive movement, and instead, one example being perhaps we get the $4,000 a month, and then the landlord says, "Hey, guess what? I know everyone's got $4,000 a month. I'm going to raise your rent by $4,000." Essentially, even a lot of the right-wing people are arguing that this could cause inflation, whereby the government's just giving you back your own money, but the sort of stratified class structure between the upper class and lower class remains. And I think some of these leftists are calling for instead of universal basic income, we have universal basic stock dividend, whereby we own the means of production digitally. And I think a lot of UBI advocacy has fallen out of favor with the left. Do you think we could? Do you think that could be perhaps too extreme to ever
So I
adopt
have a bit of a
universal basic stock
counter to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because inflation really is a function of how much money is chasing real goods and services. So yes, if you just print a bunch of money and hand it out to people, prices are going to rise. They're going to rise for some people faster than for others, depending on where that new money is injected and who has the initial boost of purchasing power before the prices kind of equilibrate to absorb that impact of the new money supply. However, if you actually have more real productivity that supports the new income, then you will not have that effect of increasing real prices. So if you have a federal land dividend to accompany the universal basic income, then what that means is companies are being productive on that land. They are creating goods which enter the economy. So whatever money is entering the economy as kind of a measure of value is in reference to those newly created goods. So this is how inflationary pressures would be averted. Now, I am wary of schemes that would increase taxes on people and redistribute existing wealth for purposes of funding a universal basic income, because at best, it would just shift the purchasing power that exists from some people to others. But in the long term, we need to grow the so-called economic pie. We cannot cling to this zero-sum fixed pie mentality. And this is why I don't believe a tax-based or money printing-based UBI would work. I think it needs to be a UBI supported by increases in real productivity.
So this is another interesting, very controversial topic, because the federal land dividend, I suppose the response from the left would be this idea that of environmentalism, that this federal land, most of it being in Idaho, Montana, like if you look at the map of the United States from space, you could tell where the federal land is. And now imagine that full of economic activity, full of bustling cities and whatnot. And obviously real estate prices would go down as people would go build there. Companies would develop the land and build homes on it. So essentially, the environmentalists, there would be a huge outcry from this. Would you say, candidate Zion, that you are of the political persuasion of Prometheanism? Essentially, Prometheanism is anti-environmentalism, as in, if we're going to become these cyborg computer people, fuck the environment. Let's just bulldoze over every tree because we're going to upload our minds to computers anyway. Or would you say, do you have some environmentalist sentiments, perhaps which you would be sympathetic to the left and the the Guyanists, so to speak.
Yes, I'm highly sympathetic to those concerns, and the futurist New Deal describes this federal land dividend as one that is green, that just specifically requires that carbon neutral organizations that do not cause dramatic damage to the surrounding area. And there are good examples of companies that do this also in an aesthetically pleasing and minimalist way, that build these new business complexes and in ways that people do not find even displeasing at that level. But we do have to concern ourselves with this. I should also say that we are people and economic projections bear this out to a pretty high degree. Who see these kind of singularitarian effects. The need to avoid a jobless apocalypse, it's a stopgap concern. So I don't imagine that the federal land dividend of this program, this lease program of this scale, would need continue for many decades. I only see that this is a problem of the coming 15 to 25 years. And in a certain sense, beyond that, all bets are off. The economy is rather transformed in ways that you alluded to already, and many others besides. But no, I would not say that we should begin converting Earth into Matryoshka brain. I would say we could of that question specifically, we should think of this as a kind of a preserve, but we also have to, in the nearer term, consider Murphy's Law kinds of problems. We need to be very circumspect about a kind of homeostasis with respect to ecosystems, and that is basically the major failing of the 20th century. Is a lack of concern for those things. That we mentioned this DuPont problem. There's 10,000 incidents besides leading to problems like climate change and other real existential risks that derive from a lack of real awareness of law and of unintended consequence problems. Like this. So we have to be, as we have greater power deriving from moving towards full automation or a high degree of automation and advanced algorithms, we have to be even more circumspect as to these law of unintended consequences problems.
So I'm sure that a lot of the audience is very rejoiced to hear that you're not an environmental nihilist or a Promethean, but your ideology, this form of economics you're proposing, it's very familiar to a lot of people. I assume Gennady might be familiar with the term Georgism, or in addition to like other economic schools such as the Austrian school, which is Rothbard and Mises, the Chicago school, which is Friedman, or the Keynesian school, which is Keynes, the Marxian school. But the Georgist school, essentially, it's very libertarian in the sense that you own the value you produce, but the land ownership is sort of ours. It's ours, and we use that to provide. To take care of the poorest in society through federal land taxes and such. Would you say a lot of your economic policy is inspired by Georgism?
Let me interject here.
No, not directly. I'm fairly. I think that it's good to welcome those comparisons, but they're a little bit different set of undertakings. Adam Kokesh, I think, is a Georgist.
I thought he was a Rothbardian, but I'm not sure.
So let's interject here for a moment, because this live stream has been going on for nearly 2 hours, and I think we should aim to end it within 2 hours in order to maximize future views. I will say I myself am not a Georgist. I've actually written in opposition to land taxation and in support of private property in land. I would classify myself as a proprietarian, essentially.
As in a Kurt Doolittle style? Proprietary.
Well, I'm a Lockean, essentially.
Oh, okay.
So I believe in first of all, there is the state of nature, and unused land is essentially in the state of nature, the person who mixes his labor with the land. is entitled to the proceeds, but it has to be actual constructive mixing of labor. You can't just have an arbitrary claim like the King of England had claim over all the forests in England and people would be executed for hunting there, even though that was their only means of livelihood. So I am in favor of people owning land, just as I'm in favor of people owning tangible objects, just as I'm in favor of people owning data about themselves. There are some issues with the Georgist land tax. I have essays on that. Feel free to look them up. But I think we should have some closing statements during the last few minutes of this live stream on some of the original subjects, such as the future of privacy and surveillance. And I can begin, and then we can go in turn to everybody. So my statement would bring it back to the aspirations of transhumanism. Transhumanism, I think, would not be the intellectual framework that it is without an intense focus on the desire to preserve the individual, hence the pursuit of life extension, hence attempts to perhaps merge the biological and the technological in that quest for self-preservation. But I think there's also the necessity to preserve the sphere of autonomy of the individual mind. It would be a frightening prospect if in the future all individual minds were completely interconnected all of the time, to the point where the distinction between where one person ends and another person begins would be blurred. I think for the transhumanist project to succeed, we need to remain these self-contained autonomous entities where if we do connect, we always connect on our own terms, per our own wishes, and it's always based on the principle of consent, and it's always a set of interactions that could be opted out of. And I think it's fundamentally a question of technological architecture. All of this can be achieved, and the goal of privacy can be respected and preserved in the course of developing brain-computer interfaces, telepathy, various predictive algorithms, artificially intelligent systems. It's just a matter of having the will. Just as with most projects in technology and society, if there's a will, there will be a way. So that is my view on the future of privacy. I believe privacy and transhumanism are quite compatible, and indeed privacy is an integral component of the transhumanist pursuit of self-preservation.
Very good.
Mic drop. Whoever wants to go next?
Candidate Zion, closing thoughts?
Yes, I do agree with Chairman Stolyarov on these points, and I think that in speaking of these outcomes that derive from advanced algorithms, all of the good for that would come to the human condition for these things. This should be the focus, and I think that also when speaking of theories of governance or economic theories, the focus must be on those on whatever best suits those outcomes as well. So there's a person who would rightly be described as a Democratic frontrunner, Senator Sanders, who supports a federal jobs guarantee, and to address the concern that Alex brought up before of housing, a federal initiative that would, in a word, be treating housing as a human right in a way that's not occurred in any real sense in the United States, and we see runaway housing costs as a result. So all of these things must, in my view, be we have to be remain somewhat philosophical on these things. If we are to see takeoff effects of various kinds, the worst thing I think that we can do is have a lot of entrenched ideologies that might prevent us from adapting to change as quickly as possible. And also be focusing on what does serve the betterment of the human species, and the kinds of outcomes that Chairman Stolyarov referenced: a high level of collectivism, a loss of individual right to privacy. That in terms of the likelihood of something that was mentioned before, a Gattaca scenario, that seems to be, although not likely in the coming years, as likely of an outcome as something like speciation of the human beings literally branching into separate species. That's why people like Elon Musk talk about this kind of thing a lot, because this technology is here, and we certainly need to address it. Of privacy, in conclusion, I'll say that it is very much the flip side of the coin of e-governance is a protection of these rights, and an ensconcing in law of a transparency and an individual right to see and control these outcomes. This is what democracy is. And I would encourage you to please check out benzion2020.com. Also, please go to transhumanist-party.org and sign up if you are not a membership. And stay tuned on March 4th at freeandequal.org. Watch that debate, please. And if you have friends in the Chicago area, encourage them to attend. And I'd love to meet anyone there. And this has been a delightful conversation. And thanks for doing this, gentlemen. Let's do it again anytime.
Awesome.
My pleasure.
You guys go. My other co-hosts, and
sure.
then I'll finish it off.
So, final thoughts on privacy. I don't know how familiar many of us are with the Hegelian dialectic, but it is our nature as human beings to engage in discourses with each other so that we can arrive closer to the truth. We can clash the thesis with the antithesis. We can sort of critique the class structure, critique the race structure, sort of dissolve the differences between us. And I do think there will come a day when we will all be one mind. I just don't know how far that day is. And I don't think people should be dragged, people should necessarily be dragged kicking and screaming through the dialectic. They should be able to arrive at enlightenment through their own rational methods. I do not think we should instate a panopticon-like society or a social credit system. And for many of the determinists who would side with Lewandowski, Alatoya Lewandowski, and the sort of Rocco's basilisk techno-monarchists, I would strongly advise we find another way. We should not be creating these artificial intelligence systems to be separate entities from us. They should be an extension of ourselves. In McLuhan's terms, we should make our technologies more open source. We should all have a say in these very existentially defining inventions we will make. Perhaps the last invention we will ever have to make. And I think we should all invent this thing together. Final thoughts, Bobby?
Nice, man. So privacy, the future may unfold and likely unfold, I think, in which we will have to have surveillance instead of surveillance, and we will have absolutely no privacy. And that's for a number of reasons, we could touch on next time. And which means that, that's scary, right? And, that's why we need Ben Zion and Gennady really succeeding with their political platforms. Extremely important, everyone. So go become a transhumanist member at the United States Transhumanist Party. You can sign up. It doesn't matter where you're at. And, make sure you support Ben Zion. And so, and of course, become a Chronics member. Life insurance when you're young is really cheap. It's only like $20 a month. Term life insurance, not a life insurance agent. Go talk to one. And there's life extension treatments coming out. We have an event.
Rudy Hoffman, I'll put you in touch.
Awesome. And we have an event August 8th, 2020. Hopefully that would be freaking epic. And so subscribe to all of our channels. Super important. I'll be coming out with life extension beer soon. So keep your eye out for that. And yeah, I look forward to living with all of you forever.
Awesome. So someone in the chat pointed out a technical problem. I guess when Bobby exited the Skype, Ben's picture scooted over, and it looked like Ben was Bobby under his name, and so that was just
they don't mind.
that was just a little portion, just so you guys know. Yes, Ben.
I'll take it as a compliment.
Sorry, Ben. Your new name is Bobby Zion. That's
Ben is
the way things are.
Ben. Ben is Ben. Bobby is Bobby. Unless we've entered some weird Mandela effect alternate universe, I'm pretty sure that's how it
Let's
goes.
hope their minds didn't meld through some form of
yeah, we are.
Right. So, anyways, I will have
We
the
are both
links.
ready to get that Neuralink.
I will have the links for everyone who participated in this debate in the descriptions. Make sure you check that out. Thank you, audience, for coming. As far as the main question we've been talking about, privacy, I guess my thoughts would be consider that maybe the scariest thing already did happen and that we've already lost our privacy. Maybe we're trapped in some weird matrix, so that's just something I think we should consider as part of our eternal life strategy. That what if everything we're doing is already being monitored and watched and potentially used to determine, like, what if there's somebody with the control switch on our life and could just turn us off, or like turn our programming off, turn us into an NPC robot or whatever, and just kill us or something? Or, there's some power structure already in place that decides if we get to live forever. And use this possibility in your eternal life strategy. That's what I would tell the eternal life fans. Consider that. I guess fear the hypothetical AI god that might already be trapped us in their matrix potentially. All right. That's my thoughts on that. Any other closing statements? Last chances.
Yeah, I'd definitely like to talk with Giannotti more on economics. He seems very, very sharp and well versed and insightful on the subject. So maybe we could set up a future live stream where we could perhaps grow intellectually from such a discussion.
Yeah.
But we'll bring up Georgism again. I think that's an interesting discsion.
We'll be doing way more
great live stream. I'd say may you live forever. Death to the Reaper, and maybe. This is for Zuckerberg, some honorary bird for Zuckerberg, Wojcicki, and the mainstream media, who is using AI for the purposes of evil to divide us and turn us on each other for the purposes of profit. Hopefully that's the last bird I'll ever have to give you. And we will create new social networks, new decentralized networks, where we will no longer need you and we can govern ourselves.
Well, heck,
Any
we
final
can't
thoughts?
end it giving the bird to Zuckerberg. Freak, I love Zuckerberg. I think Zuckerberg's on our side.
I think he's against us.
He wants to help us live forever. He wants to help us live forever.
I rededicate. Sorry, Rowan. I rededicate this bird to Susan Wojcicki. And
okay, I'm fine with that. But
nobody likes her.
I'm telling you guys, Zuckerberg is an Eternal Life fan. He wants us to live forever. He said he's most interested in questions about people. What will enable us to live forever? He's trying to put his money behind curing diseases with his
foundation. I'll rephrase that. Okay, Mr. Zuck, perhaps one day there could come a time where we could put aside our differences and create a better social network that will not use algorithmic supremacy to promote hatred and division among Americans, and perhaps we could build a better world where we are more socially conscious of how we are using our technology. And but Susan Wojcicki can keep the bird. I don't think anyone likes her.
And it's not just Zuckerberg. Yeah. I would extend that to Jews in general, freaking Israel, on our team, Zionism. Really, there's arguments for our survival, like promoting Israel, because you want to preserve those genetics. We want the Jewish ethno-state so they can have that high IQ genetics. They could save our life one day. We want those genetics.
Scientists over there, though.
Huh?
The public is not good over there. I've heard.
Public?
People. Yeah, on the ground who aren't the scientists, but so we're gonna be live streaming a lot in the future, and so we'll be inviting Giannotti and Ben on all the time. But I think we should set up maybe an interview with Giannotti, maybe a week or two after our debate.
Definitely, we should pick his brain more. You don't upload as much as it used to. I'm interested in how much you have grown and developed over the many years. You've been busy, of course, as the chairman of the Transhumanist Party. We'd like to hear more of your wisdom that may have, I would assume, has been much more refined.
We shall speak on this.
That would be interesting, and perhaps candidate Zion, we could perhaps give you a separate interview as well, whereby it's very difficult to talk on a podcast with 5 people. It's very hard for you to get your views out there while you're all taking turns talking. This has been very chaotic, but
and
we persevered.
maybe if you stay tuned, we'll be interviewing Alex. Maybe he'll run for president under the Transhumanist Party and offer free sex spots.
I think I'd like to stay behind the scenes and just write books. I don't think I'd be a very good speaker.
If we're running for president, would you offer free sex bots to everyone? Would that be part of your political candidates?
Yes, free sex bots, definitely.
You heard it here, folks.
And free gym memberships. Everyone should be ripped and jacked, and it'll be good for your eternal life. Yeah.
All right. So. That's it. Thank you guys for showing. Thank
Let's
you guys
do it again
and everyone
soon,
for
guys.
participating.
We'll do.
All right.